Recording now.
Yeah, thank you, Suresh. And very good evening to each one of you. Welcome to the second panel discussion as part of the post-draft public consultations organized by the DST CPR, that's the Department of Science and Technology Center for Policy Research at IIC Bangalore. And this is to gain insights to the draft of India's fifth National Science, Technology and Innovation Policy. This draft has been jointly formulated by the Office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India and the Department of Science and Technology through several rounds of consultations with various stakeholders and experts. Today, we are very glad to have an eminent panel, interested viewers, and a spirited team behind this unique discussion on fostering research and innovation, the road towards self reliance through STIP 2021. The discussion is divided into two rounds. In the first, about 45 minutes, we will be hearing from our panelists on the relevance of research and innovation, which lies, of course, at the core of the new draft STI policy. And this will be followed by a round of question and answers coming from our participants. I am Dr. Janice Govius, and I will be the moderator for today's session, along with Dr. Venkat Nadella, who and both of us are postdoctoral fellows at the Center for Policy Research. We have an illustrious panel today consisting of Professor Navkant Bhatt, Dr. Radha Rangarajan, and Professor Rishikesh Krishnan. Due to some unforeseen circumstances, Dr. Jamal is unable to join us. And without further ado, I now invite Venkat to take over and introduce our panelists. Over to you, Venkat.
Thank you, Janice. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to remind all participants that in the second half, after the panelists have a chance to make their initial remarks, we will do a moderated Q&A. So please feel free to type in your questions as they come to you in the common chat box. We'll curate the questions and then pose it to the speakers at the end. Please remember to keep your camera and your audio turned off when the panelists are speaking. Thank you. We have three panelists today. First, Professor Rishikesh Krishnan. He is the director and a professor of strategy at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He was earlier the director of Indian Institute of Management at Indore. He is listed in the Thinkers 50 India list of the most influential management thinkers from India. He also held the Jamuna Raghavan Chair in Entrepreneurship at IIM Bangalore from 2007 to 2010. His main areas of interest are strategy and innovation, and he'll be speaking to us. He'll be addressing a range of issues on state policy today. Next, we have Professor Navkant Bhatt. He's the chairperson at the Center for Nanoscience and Engineering at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He was awarded the Infosys Prize in Engineering and Computer Science in 2018 for his work on the design of novel biosensors based on his research in biochemistry, materials, and microelectronics. He is also a celebrated scientist entrepreneur. He is a co-founder of Pathshowed Healthcare, a company where he uses nanotechnology in designing novel medical diagnostics. Dr. Radha Rangarajan is our final speaker, a panelist. She is the Chief Scientific Officer at HealthCube, responsible for product development, clinical validation, and regulatory affairs. She has almost 2 decades of research and development experience in industry as well as in academia. She was recently awarded the FICCI Award for Excellence for Women in Research and Development in 2019 and selected as the Champions of Change, selected under the Champions of Change initiative of the Prime Minister and the Niti Aayog in 2017. We are very excited to have 3 illustrious speakers today addressing us and providing their insights on the draft STIP policy. May I first invite Professor Rishikesh Krishnan to make his opening remarks.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Can you see my screen?
Yes, Professor.
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm going to try and keep my remarks to the context, but I have decided to make them slightly broader because I wanted to draw your attention to certain aspects of the policy which I think need further elaboration. So to make that case, I need to go into a little detail. So please bear with me. I'll try as far as possible to keep to the time limit. Okay, so I think if you look at the Indian broader innovation system, there really are two tracks going on. One is the more science and engineering based, which comes from originally from the national labs, from academic institutions, from some of the more R&D driven companies, and now increasingly in multinationals which have R&D centers in India. And there is the frugal track, which is more based on ingenuity, adaptation. A large part of the informal innovation system is based on this, and some part of the formal innovation system as well. So if you look at India's formal innovation system, if you look at the science-based, I think we've had some success. We've had people like Dr. Shivram and Paul Ratnaswamy at NCL. At one point, we had all the telecom stuff that Sam Pitroda developed. We've had people like Dr. Ban and Dr. Gagandeep Kang who've developed the rotavirus vaccine. We had Dr. Paul Raj, and we've had industry people like Kiran Majumdar and Pramod Chaudhary of Praj Industries, all of whom have done interesting technology, science-based innovation, and all these innovations have actually reached the market. So we do have some record of making this happen, but there are challenges, and I'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. We also have an increasingly strong M&E or multinational R&D center framework, which has drawn on the science-based innovation system. It's taken a lot of the manpower for sure. It largely supports the innovation efforts of its parent companies and is therefore not very closely linked to what's happening in India. It tends to dominate patent statistics, and I'm going to give you some statistics in a moment. It's been pretty intrigued and influenced by the frugal system, but it continues to pretty much go on its own track, though from time to time you see some influence of the frugal innovation. Then you have the innovation by Indian companies, which is largely within the technological frontier. They do adopt frugal approaches, but a lot of the focus is on process innovation, essentially to meet the local needs of access and affordability. And over time, of course, they've also tried to meet global needs in some industries like software and pharmaceuticals. And of late, in the last maybe 6-7 years, we've also seen the startup ecosystem becoming increasingly visible. Though at least some analysis which have been done of these startups suggests that the prominent ones, the ones with all those big valuations, are largely adaptive. They have very small patent portfolios, and they are not really driven by the science-based R&D system. So as I said, the multinational R&D in India started by tapping into low-cost talent. Over time, it's shifted from just cost arbitrage to knowledge augmentation. It has contributed to products developed by their global parents. And of course, some R&D centers have graduated to the lead role, both for legacy products and for products for developing and emerging markets. And I think one of the challenges for the new STI policy is how do you really integrate or work with this system? This system seems to be pretty much geared to the global market, geared to the parent companies, but doesn't seem to be really involved. There is mention of this in the policy, by the way, of course there is mention, but I'm not very clear that there are good mechanisms to integrate this system with what is happening in India. And I think this is one area where the policy needs to elaborate further. Otherwise, we'll have very little connect with the local ecosystem. You've all probably seen figures like this before. This is the average number of US patents awarded per year to inventors based in India or Indian assignees. The only thing you need to focus on is the last row, where you'll see that the number of patents awarded to MNCs resulting out of innovation in India is about something like 3/4 of the total. The patents awarded to Indian companies and Indian research and academia is small. And even if you look at Indian patents, you will see that a dominant percentage of the patents go to MNCs. Though, of course, this is not MNC R&D in India alone. This also represents patents taken by the parent company for innovation which was done elsewhere. So it's a combination of both. But just look at those last columns, those last bars. and you'll see that it's MNCs that dominate patenting in India. Though there was some mention of patents in the policy document, once again, I felt that there wasn't really much, elaboration of this whole issue of how foreign companies really dominate the Indian patent scenario. And I thought this was another gap which perhaps needs some, so it needs to be addressed in some way or the other. Okay, then coming to frugal innovation, interestingly, some of the most impactful frugal innovation has not been from grassroots innovators, though there's a lot of talk about grassroots innovators. It's actually been from people like Arvind Eye Hospital or Narayana Hrudayalaya. These are companies which haven't done traditional R&D based technology innovation, but they have done some pretty nifty process and business model innovation, which has resulted in some of the best high quality, low cost cataract and cardiac surgery in the world. So another challenge for us in the policy is how do we support this kind of innovation? This may not come under the normal umbrella or guise of R&D driven innovation, but this is very impactful. This is solving exactly the kind of problems we would like to solve in India, that is providing low cost healthcare. In fact, there was a study by this UK based consulting firm Nesta in 2012, which mapped out some of the frugal innovations that India could take credit for, and almost all of these have not really benefited from the science and R&D driven innovation system. But many of them have been quite impactful, including some of the things I just mentioned. Of course, a few of them have benefited, but not all of them. So I think this is another challenge for the policy. I did see the word frugal innovation mentioned in a couple of places, but I didn't see any very significant effort to engage with this kind of frugal innovation. Okay, so now let me just come to the second part of my talk, which is what do we actually need in a policy? And does the new STI policy, how does it stack up against what we need, especially based on what has worked in India, what has been successful? Because we have a history now of 60, 70 years of trying different things out, what's really worked. And my focus once again here is on technology and innovation. It is not on the science basic research part of it, which was covered partly in the earlier discussion, and I'm not really the right person to talk about that. So just two things I'd like you to keep in mind, that if you look at the trajectory for innovation in developing countries, there was a very good study by Forbes and Wield almost 20 years ago, which essentially drew a kind of a progression which companies go through. They first learn how to produce, usually by borrowing technology or by licensing it. They then learn to produce efficiently, which is how do you take that technology which you sourced and do the same, achieve the same productivity as the source of the technology. Then how do you move to improve production? How do you go beyond the frontier, which very few companies in India have historically? And then, of course, how do you get into designing new products finally? So if you just look at India's track record in the first three steps, which are critical for industrial competitiveness, is not that great. In fact, we imported steel technology in the 50s and 60s. Even by the 80s, we were not really very good in absorbing and adapting that technology. And it's taken quite some time to get near the technology frontier in many industries. So one of the challenges, and this is acknowledged in the policy, but again, I don't know whether we really have any steps on how we are going to accelerate this process, but that's one of the things we need to focus on. We should also remember that the level of innovation in any country or geography is a function of multiple things. It's a function of inputs, it's a function of what firms do, it's also a function of the incentives. I tend to take a firm-driven view of innovation because I'm a student of strategy and of management in general. And even if innovation or ideas are going to originate in academic or research institutions, finally firms have to take them to the market. So unless you have innovative firms, you are unlikely to see the benefits of innovation going out into the larger economy. So the good news is we already have good models for how to make this happen. To my mind, just the Department of Biotechnology's BIRAC program, it covers every possible stakeholder. It covers every possible stage of the process and is probably the only government program in which the government gives R&D funds directly to the private sector through an organized process, systematic process. You have R&D grants. So to my mind, a very simple policy would be just to replicate BIRAC across other departments, other ministries. That's not specifically mentioned in the policy, though there is talk of developing end-to-end programs, but I think there's already a blueprint we have available. We've also tried interesting experiments like the Collaborative Automotive Research Program in 2004, which resulted in some really good startups like Sedimac in the Mumbai-Pune region. Again, I think that's another good blueprint which the policy could possibly look at. I think the reason I'm focusing on this is we need implementation, because policy statements are very useful, but finally, if you want results, it needs to get implemented. And for that, you need blueprints, you need examples of how you're going to make these things happen. During COVID, we've had excellent examples of how to identify and coordinate requirements. Now, one of the challenges, I think, in getting technology and innovation working in India is to manage the demand side. Most of our initiatives and policies are supply side policies. We want to give more money to companies. We want to, incentivize R&D and so on. But the demand side is weak. I think the good thing that happened during COVID is there was a good effort to identify and coordinate requirements. This needs to be magnified many times going forward. There is a clear mechanism for this for strategic technologies in the new policy, and that's a good move. But however, what are you going to do for non-strategic technologies? And many non-strategic areas are critical to India. Education, health, etc. may not be called strategic in the normal way, where usually defense and things like that are included. But those are extremely important for India. So we need to have mechanisms to identify demand. And if you identify demand, you will be able to solve the right problems, like Niramay, which is trying to do early detection of breast cancer using thermal imaging, or Vigyan Labs, which is trying to control the amount of power that data centers consume, or Taral Tech, which is trying to create microbe-free safe water from hand pumps. If you get the demand side right, then you can actually start helping startups solve the right problems, because one of the challenges many startups face is simply understanding what problems they should be solving. There's also a need to help identify those problems. To my mind, there are excellent programs like the Stanford India Biodesign Program, which has been around for several years now, since 2007, where the inventors do a comprehensive needs assessment across primary health centers, district hospitals, and specialty hospitals. Again, a blueprint like this would be good to replicate across sectors so that there is a systematic need identification process. We need to be able to create open platforms for innovation. I didn't see much about this. I think this is something which should be part of the policy. We have one area where we have done well is actually in the whole fintech space, where we have created an open yet secure platform where the critical parts are under government, but there are a lot of APIs open and people can do lots of stuff, like you can have companies which are doing payment services and so many other services. We need to create more such open platforms. I might have missed it, but I didn't see a very explicit mention of this when I read the policy document. Regulators play a huge role in influencing innovation. So unless you have regulators who are also willing to facilitate innovation, it's not going to happen. This also, to the best of my knowledge, was not there in the policy. Some regulators are already doing it. The RBI, for example, has started creating regulatory sandboxes to enable live testing of new products in retail payments, cross-border payments, etc. Other regulators need to emulate this. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to do this well. I mean, and you can see the advantage of the regulators being proactive in COVID, right? We got all our testing kits, we got our vaccines all on the fast track, but that needs to be replicated, or at least we need some attention to that in normal times as well. We need to speed up cycle times. This is a big challenge. Recently, you would have all read about the Tejas big order being placed by the Air Force, but this is 35 years after the Tejas program started. Rotavirus vaccine also took 30 plus years to get to market. So cycle times have to be shortened. I did not see a very specific mention of this in the policy. Again, I might have missed it, but it's probably important because without this, you won't have things reaching the market in time. You need to move to innovation clusters. I think this is mentioned in the policy, but there's certainly, we need to find the right models for that. We also need to have the kind of initiative like we see in the IIT Madras Research Park, which is trying to connect academia to industry. Again, examples like this would be useful related to the policy, because there are some very specific things that IIT Madras has done which make this work. For example, requiring that companies and startups located in the research park have norms for interaction with the institute. So it can't be just a real estate play. Startups and companies located there have to show evidence that they are interacting with the institute for projects, for consultancy and things like that. We should nudge professors to choose the right projects. I don't have enough time. I'm going to skip this slide. Government procurement is critical. It's mentioned in the policy. There's also stuff about how the GFR needs to change. I think those are all positive things. I hope they can be put into practice. We need to help the small collaborate with giants. I didn't see too much on this, but I think this is again important. I mean, you all know that My Lab, which was the first company to create RT-PCR kits, which got approved, was able to rapidly reach the market thanks to Serum Institute and Syngene. And if these two big players had not come in to help them, they wouldn't have been able to scale up. So the government needs to find ways of facilitating this kind of thing. Of course, there's a lot of stuff which can be done on strategic development and transfer of technology. I particularly like this example because this Advanced Research Center in Hyderabad, they, instead of trying to do everything themselves, they started with a technology which had been developed in the Ukraine, but was just not good enough, needed improvement, needed upgradation. And then they worked with those Ukrainian scientists and engineers to finally take this to the market over this whole cycle. So there are a lot of innovative things which can be done, and I think we need to encourage those. So my just sort of summing up comments are that the policy seems to integrate well with the education policy. There's mention of the research fund, involvement and integration with HEIs. But I think there needs to be more integration with some other players who have become significant players in innovation in the last decade. Niti Aayog, for example, is running all these Atal Innovation Mission. It's running a lot of the startup programs. The Department for Promotion of Industry and Internal Trade is the one which gives the startup recognition, which also does all the IP policies. Regulatory agencies are critical, including the drug controller and CDSCO. So all these bodies need to be very much part of the innovation policy. They are mentioned, but at a very high level. So I think it might help to get a little more specific. Last point, which I want to make, is that all of this is fine, but unless you have companies and entrepreneurs with high aspiration, it's not going to take off. So I think we really need to develop that leadership. I'm not so sure this is a job for policy alone, but the fact is, unless we have people like the visionaries who got our generic pharma industry going, or the people who run our motorcycle industry today, which accounts for 40% of global volume, and Indian players account for 77% of the Indian market. And all of them have over time developed manufacturing and technology which enables them to meet the needs of Indian customers. Unless you have those really charged up companies who are willing to invest in capability building, you're not going to be able to successfully take technology to the market. So I'm not sure, again, from the policy point of view, what can be done to do that, but I think that needs to be recognized that just these mechanical things will not help unless you also have aspiration. And that's where I think competition and competitiveness becomes important. That little bit of extra pressure really gets people to stretch themselves. And you can see that in an industry like the motorcycle industry. So what I said today is draws on a couple of my earlier books. One I wrote in 2010, which was largely on innovation policy, and one which I wrote in 2013 with Vinay Dabholkar, which looked at firm level innovation. So thank you. I think I overshot by a few minutes. My apologies, but I just tried to link all of this to the innovation policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rishi Krishnan, for a great talk. You touched on a broad range of innovation and tech absorption issues. I'm also very glad you gave us very pointed inputs on how SKIP can address some of these important concepts. And more importantly, you identified the specific role of the government, that is to address the demand side to spawn off the innovation ecosystem. We're very thankful for your inputs. Now, before I invite the next panelist, may I please request the guests to mute their microphones and turn off their cameras when the panelists are speaking. And if you have any questions, please type it in the chat box. We will curate them and pose it to the panelists after they finish with their opening remarks. Now, may I please invite Professor Navkant Bhatt to provide his remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Venkat. As I said, I don't have any slides, but let me touch upon a few aspects. Professor Rishikesh has already covered quite a few points. Before that, there is a small correction. When Venkat introduced me, he said, I'm chair of Center for Nanoscience. I'm no longer chair of Center for Nanoscience. I stepped down as a chair in August 2020. So, small correction on that. This is about science, technology, innovation policy for what is now called Atmanirbharta. What it essentially means is that through science research, we want to create knowledge, and then we want to translate the knowledge, of course, through innovation. Research creates knowledge, innovation translates the knowledge and creates wealth. And presumably, this should be a continuous cycle, and the wealth should flow back into research and, so on and so forth. And if you do it really well, perhaps you will be the leader, world leader, that is, in science and technology, perhaps in the next decade to come, right? So that is the big picture, in my opinion. Now, let's ask the question, if we need to do this, what is very essential? And I would like this to be sort of clearly articulated in the policy going forward. In my opinion, we are now talking of technology creation, indigenous technology as far as possible, and the technology is at the forefront. Technology cannot be created by one or two individuals. Let me repeat this. Research excellence is different compared to technology excellence. One scientist can do research and get a Nobel Prize. That is different. Of course, that creates knowledge. But when you want to translate a knowledge, create a technology and manufacturing, you need scale. You need a very large number of resources, human resources to begin with, right? So this scale is very important in my opinion, and this scale at the highest quality, right? It's not just the mere quantity at the highest quality. Let me give an example. I would like something like this to happen across the board, clearly articulated in this technology policy. 20 years ago, when we wanted to start a new paradigm shift in nanoelectronics in this country, early 2000, we had a lot of consultative meetings at Principal Scientific Advisor's office back then, Dr. Chidambaram. And it was clearly recognized that we have missed the so-called bus of microelectronics. I'll come back to this towards the end, right? And going forward, we cannot afford to do that, because today electronics and semiconductors is $2 trillion industry in the world. And our country's contribution is meager 30 billion, about a percentage or so. And we are still dependent on imports. The given current geopolitical situation is very scary. You can't have this situation. So that is when it was decided that, of course, you have to start with research, and you cannot really have a socialistic view and just spread the research money everywhere. You create centers of excellences, right, which cannot be done in every location. So it was decided that 2 centers of excellences will be created. But these 2 centers of excellences cannot really create a scale, right? The scale that I was talking about. I'll keep harping on the scale, right? So that is when we sort of ingeniously came up with what we now call hub and spoke model, right? And we sort of created this policy right at that stage, that when we create these centers of excellences, 2 of them, one at IISc Bangalore, one at IIT Bombay, these centers of excellences will not only support research in their respective institute, but they will launch a national program called Indian Nanoelectronics Users Program. with a clear mandate that the scale has to be ensured. You mentor a large number of institutes across the country, while working on your own research, trying to be at the forefront at the international level. You also take it as your responsibility and bring the other institute into this fold, this emerging new area in the very important technological area of nanoelectronics, as I mentioned. And this was a very novel concept at then. It was also starting to democratize research infrastructure. What it meant was that the infrastructure, both human and equipment infrastructure, which is being created in these two centers, will be made available to the entire nation, not on paper, but in reality, right? And that will be benchmarked. The research benchmark is something that Venkat had mentioned in his email. How do you benchmark it, right? So what we actually did was we created a very structured program. We actually had what is called level 1, level 2, and level 3 programs for this users program. Level 1 was more of a familiarization, just getting all the researchers, PhD scholars and faculty from all around the country through workshops conducted maybe 3 or 4 times in a year. Tell them what is this new area all about, what can be done, right? And follow it up with what is called the level 2 hands-on training, during which you bring these people to your place. They will spend 2 to 3 weeks, and your technical staff and faculty will mentor them for those 2 to 3 weeks and actually take them through all the different processes of research, right? That is level 2. And during this level 2, we also sort of enthuse them to come up with their research agenda, what they would like to achieve in the next 5 to 10 years, bring them back to what is called a level 3 program, wherein they will spend 6 months to 12 months in these facilities and actually execute their research. There is absolutely no dearth in the country for ideas. With billion people, we have more than billion ideas in the country, right? What is not available for them is access to very sophisticated infrastructure. And this barrier was completely removed in this program. And thereby, guess what? In the last 10 years or so, more than 7,000 researchers across the country were trained through these two centers. This is what I mean by hub and spoke model, right? And thereby, several of them who could not have dreamt to, do their PhD research in this cutting edge emerging research area could complete their PhD, could publish in very high impact journals, and could get international patents. They were sort of transcending the boundaries, very high-end research and also creating intellectual property, simply because of this very small intervention, a very important change in culture, that infrastructure funded by government in publicly funded institution belongs to the nation. And this must be done going forward as a mandate, in my opinion, in the new science and technology and innovation policy. A scientist's performance should be measured, and an institute performance should be measured, not just based on how many papers they published, what citations numbers they got for publication, but how much did they share their infrastructure? How did they enable hub and spoke model? How many more other institutes could come and use their facilities? I want this to be very clearly articulated in this STIP policy so that every researcher, every institute in the country will open up. Again, it goes back to this so-called open science policy that was discussed, I believe, in the earlier session. Only when we do that, we get a scale, right? Unless we get a scale, we cannot create technologies in advanced fields, right? That is number one. Number two, okay, a related thing we were doing, changing mindset is very difficult. we actually sort of took it further and we created a portal, again, thanks to Principal Scientific Advisor's Office, called iSTEM. It was actually launched by the Prime Minister in the last Science Congress. It stands for Indian Science, Technology and Engineering Facility Map. Today you can Google this. This is a virtual portal that is available. The idea is that we did it in nanoelectronics in these two centers, but we want to scale it to all other science and technology areas for all institutes through this virtual portal, which will first collect all the information, and then any researcher anywhere in the country should be able to query, trying to ask the question, oh, I need a scanning electron microscope. Where is the nearest center? I can find this. And this portal will tell the researcher, and then the researcher should be able to book this online, using digital platform and be able to access this facility, right? So this is a kind of, and you know what? The performance of scientists and researcher, including, the ranking, NIRF ranking, should be based on how institutes were open in sharing their facilities. I would like this to be articulated in the STIP policy going forward, right? And benchmarking and all that should be part of this thought process. We need to change our mindset of institutions, of scientists and researchers, and create this open policy and scale. Scale is what we want, right? That is number one. That is in terms of knowledge creation, right? And let me come to this translation business, right? And again, Professor Rishikesh has already talked quite a few things. But let me tell you something. The very welcome thing in this policy is that it clearly says the funding would be doubled in the next 5 years. And it also says that states will also start funding science and technology. That's a very, very great move. But I want this to be, put in numbers, right? In percentages, what fraction, what percentage of GDP will be set aside for science and technology research and innovation. I'll come to that, startups, in a minute. The greatest example is SBIR policy in US. In fact, DBT BIRAC is sort of modeled along those lines. But there's something very interesting in SBIR, which is Small Business Innovation Research. In the US, there is no dearth for venture capitalists. You get a dime a dozen venture capitalists. Despite that, governments fund private entities, startups, and companies. So much so that each department which does science and technology funding should set aside 3.2% of their annual outlay, 3.2% of their annual outlay, which is very substantial, to fund just the small companies. Unless you have this kind of metric, you need to say that, firstly, each government department will set aside so much percentage of GDP, whatever that is, right? Out of that kitty, 3% is set aside for funding small businesses, right? That benchmark, are they doing that? Benchmarking has to be across the board, right? For scientists, institutions, and also government departments as well. Unless you have these numbers clearly articulated in the policy, then it becomes very fuzzy, right? So that is another very important point I wanted to bring up. And also through that, you must fund these startups through their entire life cycle. For starting, of course, and then for protecting IPs, we are now talking of deep science and technology based companies if you want to be Atmanirbhar, right? And that costs very, very substantially. Of course, TIFAC has a program to fund patents, but that is minuscule. That is not sufficient. You really need to set aside very significant amount to just fund patents that are going to be generated by these startups, right? And again, you need to have a metric, a clear, numbers which need to be set aside to enable that, right? And market access, which is very, very important, right? You need to, it's not just creating technologies, you need to also provide market access, right? So that needs to be enabled, right? So that is from research to translation in enabling that, right? in all these, we need to really change the mindset, change the culture. Before I conclude, let me just touch upon one last thing. That is also sort of articulated in the science and technology innovation draft, but I want it to be elaborated even further. That is to do with strategic technologies, right? It also talks about setting up what is called STDF, Strategic Technology Development Fund. But in my opinion, there are two very important things here. One is vision, the other one is speed. We need to have a 360-degree vision in identifying what is strategic technology, right? And then execute it in lightning speed. In these high-tech areas, let me again give an example of semiconductor electronics, because this is something that we have been working on for last 2 decades, and with various departments of the government, including Niti Aayog and PSA's office. Let me give an example again here. As I said, worldwide electronics market is $2 to $3 trillion, which is as big as our GDP. Whether it is your cell phone, whether it is your laptop, all these IT infrastructure is all based on electronics and semiconductors. Today, as I said, the most advanced semiconductor fab is generations behind the state behind the that. This change made in and it's not people are not aware, policymakers are not aware. Despite pushing these things, there are again different technologies. There is an emerging technology called gallium nitride technology, and we have been saying that let's establish commercial gallium nitride fab foundry in the country. We have been working at it for last 10 years. This is where I'm saying lightning speed is important. You need to identify through this strategic technology board what is strategic technology. After identifying that, you need to have plans and policies, and also enablement for these boards so that this execution happens. Because if you lose 2 years, you have already gone to a new generation of technologies in this fast-paced technologies, right? So this is another very important point I want to bring up here. I would like this to be articulated clearly that strategic technologies have to be identified and they got to be executed at lightning speed, right? So then let me just summarize. The change in culture and mindset is very important. Hub and spoke model to scale up our research infrastructure and the trained manpower, trained people that come out, and then they create technologies, and that is where you need enablement through startups, setting aside like SBIR like policies, and finally identifying strategic technologies and executing that at lightning. If these could be articulated, then that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Navkant Bhatt, for providing some very concrete points on drawing from your wide experience with nanoelectronics users program, how you built along with IIT Bombay a large network of researchers working on this knowledge creation side, and also on how this created knowledge can be translated, the importance of intent, of speed, and having a concrete plan. We will definitely note all these points down and pass it on to the PS's office as well as DST working on this policy. Before I invite the third and final panelist to make her opening remarks, I would like to once again remind all the guests to please turn off your audio if when the panelist is speaking. If you have any questions for the panelists, please share it with us in the chat box. We will curate these questions and pose it to the panelists at the end of their remarks. Now, may I please invite Dr. Radha Rangarajan to make her opening remarks.
Thank you so much, Venkat. Thank you to to the organizers for inviting me to be present here. As the third speaker, it is often difficult to make remarks which haven't been covered before. Certainly, both Rishikesh and Afghan covered a lot of the ground that I also wanted to speak about. However, my perspective may be somewhat different because I'm actually a practitioner of innovation. And before I start with my comments, I'd like to just give you a little bit of background and tell you about my experience, which really then leads into the comments, which will help you perhaps understand the background of my or the context in which I make my comments. I after my education and training in the US, Stanford, Rockefeller University, and Harvard, I came back to India in 2003. And I was very interested in translational work and product development. And I went to work in the drug discovery division of Dr. Reddy's Laboratories, which at that time was very actively pursuing cutting edge drug discovery research with the objective of taking novel drugs to the market. I stayed at Dr. Reddy's till the end of 2009, when the company decided to change its business model and convert its drug discovery unit into a services unit, providing contract research services to MNCs and others. Being a product person myself, I felt that I did not fit there. And looking around the Indian landscape, I found that opportunities to pursue novel research in industry were very limited. And I decided to start my own company. And I started the company in 2010, 2011. And was able to locate the company, was able to play, to find space in the technology business incubator in the University of Hyderabad, which was then, you recall, those were early days of incubators, and we were one of the first occupants of the incubator. And I was I worked together with Professor Hasnain and even designing and putting the incubator up to make it conducive for translational research and product development. Around the same time was when BIRAC was founded. So in some ways, my company Vitas Pharma's trajectory was was parallel to BIRAC's trajectory. In fact, we were perhaps the recipients of the first set of grants from each of the programs that BIRAC had, whether it's the BIG or the BIPPs and so on. So and then we engaged with academia in collaborating on research. I had collaborators at IISER Pune and other places, and really the vision of the company was to develop novel drugs. And I emphasize novel because that's a much abused word, just as innovation is a much abused word in India. And the idea was to develop completely new drugs to treat highly resistant infections. And highly resistant, multi-drug resistant infections continue to be a huge public health need in India and globally. But certainly, India has one of the highest burdens of these infections. And our approach was to say that incremental innovation, meaning a 6th generation fluoroquinolone or a 6th generation cephalosporin won't do the job. So we need to look at completely novel chemical structures. So we were trying to do something which was very different from what the Indian ecosystem was doing or willing to do. And really but the hope was that we could push the edge of the envelope and do high quality cutting edge work in India and take to market both in India and globally products of research for a very, very well-defined unmet need. The assumption here was that we would raise money in tranches, starting with BIRAC funding, private funding, and larger and larger tranches. Those were assumptions. The other assumption and the business model was that we would go to a certain stage of development. We didn't intend to go all the way to market, but we intended to go up to phase 2, so we could license out products of value and reap benefit, as well as retain value for India by being able to demand that we retain rights to the India market. And we were quite happy being funded by grants from BIRAC and so on, to say that the price for these drugs, even though they would be completely novel and patent protected, that such drugs would then be available at an affordable cost. This was the model. We had multiple grants, including grants from the Wellcome Trust, and we had private funding as well. We raised a small round of private funding. But ultimately, we needed to raise the $3 to $5 million to take our drugs into phase 1 clinical trials. And we couldn't find that money in India. And the advice we got everywhere was that we would have to invert the company, take the company outside of India, and then raise money to take the compounds forward, which was a model which continues to be a model that succeeds, which continues to be the model that many entrepreneurs doing this kind of high risk, high reward research are pursuing, but was a model that I wasn't quite ready for. But ultimately, in 2019, we sold the entire IP portfolio to a UK-based company because we found that swimming against the tide in India was getting harder and harder. Now, you may look at the story and you may listen to the story and wonder if the story is what the learning lessons are, and there are many learning lessons which I took from my experience, and I continue to be firmly embedded in the startup ecosystem. I mentor many startups, and I'm Chief Scientific Officer for a medical devices startup called HealthCube, and we're working on point-of-care diagnostics to serve a very huge public health need in India, which is the lack of availability of basic diagnostics in semi-urban and rural areas. So I remain firmly embedded within the innovation ecosystem. But from my experiences and from reading the innovation policy, the STIP, I'd like to make the following comments. The first is that it is very important that the multiple stakeholders that are involved in making an innovation successful. So by that I mean the innovators themselves, the patrons of innovators, those are government and private investors and markets, that these are all somehow in the same geography or in the same location. It's very difficult when you develop something in, you're doing the research in one place and your investors are somewhere else and your market is in yet another place. So that is, bringing all of these stakeholders together and being able to provide the entrepreneur synergies. This is very important. And in order for this to happen, I think one of the most important things is that we need to set innovation priorities for India. When we set innovation priorities, then we can line up everything that comes after it, including where should BIRAC put the funding, what products should be pursued in mission mode, what products, of this pie of 100 rupees, should we set aside 80 rupees for incremental innovation, but 20 rupees for really the science of tomorrow, what Noubar Afeyan of Moderna Therapeutics likes to call audacious innovation. If we set innovation priorities correctly, we can divide this pie in a way that we are not only innovating for today, but we're innovating for tomorrow. And when we have that clarity, investment, markets, and innovators all line up very nicely. And a very good example of that is what has happened with COVID-19 vaccine development. And so I was not able to see in this document how innovation priorities are going to be set. Although I think that the document does a fabulous job of really describing what an innovation infrastructure should look like. Even going to the extent of saying that certain products should be developed in mission mode. However, I think before all of this can happen, we need to define these innovation priorities. Now, I'll tell you what happens when you don't define these things very well. If you leave innovation priorities to be set in a decentralized manner, meaning industry sets its own priorities, state governments set their own priorities, then you don't get a synergy. And whatever capital exists, it gets really fragmented. So I'm a big believer in the mission mode. I'm a big believer in setting our sights on specific products and going all the way. And we know that there are many examples of this that work. Our space missions have worked in that manner. Even the rotavirus vaccine, even though it took a very long time, it succeeded because of this mission mode. And so I think that priority setting with a division between immediate versus future innovation, this is a big part of making India a more successful innovator-driven company. The second thing I want to say is that I was specifically asked to also look at how human capital has to be aligned to deliver on the innovation agenda. So my own experience with running a startup that was very R&D driven was that it was difficult to find people who had the innovative mindset. And this is because even in science and technology, we're a very services-driven economy. We provide custom research services to the world. But that has bred a generation of scientists who are capable of following instructions, but not necessarily ideating, troubleshooting, and being completely being creative and imaginative. I am generalizing here, but what I'm trying to say is that in order for us to build the human capital that is capable of addressing the innovation agenda, we really need to go back to the school level and to the college level and create curricula that are that encourage innovative questioning. So I think that human capital will need, along with this innovation policy, we really need to look at how we're going to power this agenda with the right kind of people. And then I also noticed that while there's a very elaborate description of what the innovation infrastructure can be, what is noticeably missing is what will the leadership of this innovation agency, for lack of a better word, what will it look like? And here I'd say that after setting the innovation priorities, identifying those people who can drive innovation, and we don't need one or two of them, we actually need a battery of them, representing the different sectors. This will make the biggest difference to, between failure and success. Finding the right leadership will mean that we are able to then unleash or create a cadre of scientists and researchers who are able to deliver to budgets, to timelines, able to work within a certain innovation structure. But that layer of leadership has to be in place and has to be drawn from a wide pool, not just limited to academia or industry, but really people who span a number of different disciplines. We need to address biases in terms of who enters this innovation space, because even today, when you look at startups, you look at founders, you see a very large, you don't see gender equities, and a lot of different kinds of biases continue to operate. So we can address this by bringing in the right leadership, bringing in the right training programs, creating safe environments, building a really good network of sponsors and mentors, and making sure that leadership is accountable. So I think from a human capital perspective and from the perspective of this policy, some of this can be elaborated further. And finally, the piece that I think also was Rishikesh referred to, and this is the role of the regulators. We need, especially on the life sciences side, products are regulated, whether it's a device or it's a drug. All of these are regulated products, and they must be regulated products. But at the same time, we must have both transparency, and we should have very high level of competence within these regulatory agencies so that innovation can be fast-tracked and innovation can be delivered to the citizens in a manner that is trusted. I emphasize that because if you look around today and you talk to doctors, you talk to people who use innovative products, there is a very high discount on India-made products because there isn't trust in quality. And that can come by making sure that what we approve and what we take to market is really of the highest quality. So those were some of my comments and responses to the innovation policy. I hope that's of some use, and I'm happy to take questions. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radha Rangarajan. Your personal story is very illuminating in this context and very pertinent. Is how can, despite all the hard work, scientist, entrepreneur, and their firms, stand the tested model of flipping and still be relevant. You also gave several important comments that we will pass on to the DST and Office of PSA. We have a few questions, but I would like to be a little greedy and ask my question first to all three panelists who touched on this, and get your reflections and insights on this. Something that all of you touched on is the issue of leadership. It's the people factor. The many psychological qualities that leaders build, but also as ecosystem builders, as institutional builders, for science and knowledge creation on the one hand, as well as on translation on the other. So my question to you is, is it something that the government can put at the forefront? Of course they can, but is it something that the government should put at the very forefront? Is after they list down their priorities and their intent, how do they go about picking leaders? How do they plan? How do they approach this very elusive element that seems to be so important in all of STI policies? I hope, yeah. So I think Dr. Rangarajan lost the connection and she's just back.
I just got back. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll just summarize the question. I'm posing my question first. Is okay. To all three panelists is, what role does leadership play? You all touched on the importance of leadership and people. What role does leadership play, and how should the government, or rather the governments, the public space, go about planning the role of leadership in STI policies and in building innovation ecosystems? I would let any of you go first.
Should I respond to that, Venkat?
Yes, Doctor.
Radha, go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So, are you asking what kind of leadership, Venkat, or what is your, can you clarify your question a bit? What specifically are you looking to address?
Yes. So after we set the innovation priorities, after we know what sort of path we want to take, whether we want to be very high risk, whether we want to solve local problems, whether we want to experiment and be on the global front. How do we go about picking leaders? Because it's something that is thought about intuitively as an organic process that comes up.
Right.
But how does the government go about thinking of such a process? Like, do they pick winners like in South Korea? Do they go completely state-driven like in China? Or is there something else that is there in your minds? Like in your opinion?
Right. So I think that identifying people, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think identifying the right leadership um, is not a simple thing, but I think there are some guiding principles. So, for example, we need people who have an first of all have an interest in translating research into products. So that's a very high, that's a number one requirement, because people who have only been who have focused on academic research are not necessarily able to envision the entire pathway to go to market. So I think we need people who have that combination of experience between spanning academia, industry, or who have a strong interest in translating research into products. So I think that's number one. And number two is we need people who have who can drive the science, or who can drive the innovation. Dr. Bhan was relentless, right? He had a vision whatever his vision was, whether it was BIRAC, whether it was the rotavirus vaccine, there was a certain relentlessness to it. And that is something we need, because there's going to be hundreds of challenges along the way. And so we need people who are so steeped in that mission that they are willing to that they are willing to put their neck out and do what it takes. And the third thing is really about being able to bring multiple stakeholders together and create synergies. And I'm a very big believer in this, because we can't create innovative products. We can't really further the innovation agenda unless we work collaboratively. And so we need people who are not going to seek, or who are willing to transcend the individual capacities of their teams or them as individuals, and really build out synergies across various teams, sectors, people, stakeholders. That I think is a very essential requirement for these leaders to succeed. So in the model that I think, there's multiple innovation priorities that we set out, and we empower, we empower specific leaders to set the product maps for their sectors. Then we fund all the way, like Navkant was saying, fund all the way, and then and allow these leaders to then build the organizations that they need to deliver on the agenda.
I think, Venkat, one good thing that's happened during COVID is that a lot of leaders have been thrown out. You just have to look around and you'll see them. I mean, if you just look at people who have taken up many of these challenges, worked on them, not necessarily only scientists, but there are a lot of techno manager kind of people. I don't want to give you names on recording, but I can give you several names offline if you want. People who have shown that they've really taken up some of those challenges and made them work. So sometimes, just tough situations really help you identify who the real leaders are. And I think if anybody looks back at the last 6 to 9 months, at least in this biomedical vaccine, that whole domain, I think who are the leaders and who are not, that's pretty clear now. You can actually figure them out and you can go back to them. I'm sure somebody like Professor Bhatt, similarly, who's been in this nanoscience area for the last 10-15 years, he and a few others would be able to identify who are the leaders there. So I think it's not all that difficult, but yeah, obviously going forward, you would like to have transparent process and obviously people who show potential, who meet metrics, all of that. I mean, you don't want, for example, suppose you have a program where you're funding companies across the life cycle. You don't want that to become another rent-seeking activity. So obviously you need checks and balances in there. But I think the leaders get, not so difficult to identify if you look around.
Yeah, if I were to just add a little more, I mean, firstly, Venkat, the question is a little fuzzy. You know, there's so many leadership positions, each position requires different skill sets. But yeah, I mean, as both Radha and Rishikesh have said, you know, I don't think it is difficult to find leaders. But let me just mention this. I'm sure you must have read this book by Kalam, Wings of Fire. He recounts how Satish Dhawan was a leader leading from the front, and he says Kalam was working with Satish Dhawan and, you know, on various ISRO missions. When one of the mission failed, Satish Dhawan went in front to the press and said, you know, it was because of him the mission failed. And the next mission, when it succeeded, he let Kalam and others to go forward and speak to the press. You know, the leader should lead from the front and take the team along. You know, but more importantly, let me say, the leaders must be empowered. You can't change the leaders and ask them to run a 100-meter sprint, you know. You can't say that, oh, you, by the way, this is GFR, you know, this is what our finance says. I mean, you don't change them. You empower them, right? And then things will happen.
Thank you very much. I have a message. Am I still audible? Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yes. Okay. I have a message that my internet is poor. I have a question from Dr. Momita to Dr. Radha Rangarajan. She asked, do you see for open source drug discovery in neglected disease area in India?
Yes, I do, provided we are willing to put the current market model on its head. In the current model, the only way that a company can really take a product to market is if market is willing to pay a certain premium for stuff that comes out of very high level of R&D, where cost is high, risk is high. If cost and risk are shared, then it is possible to take drugs to market for neglected diseases and for all parties concerned to be winners. But it requires a very high level of collaboration in order for this model to succeed. But I think it can be done. The second thing is that open source drug discovery, there needs to be a way to incentivize the different individuals or teams that are involved in this process, and that has not been figured out. So I think, for example, if you bring in private investment into an open source drug discovery model, then what's in it for the investor? Therefore, both the funding model and the go-to-market model, along with the incentivization model, these things need to be figured out. For example, if investors put money into a firm like this, which is using open source drug discovery, they should be incentivized for their investment. Today, nobody gets any incentive for investing in R&D from the private sector, private investors. So these sorts of systemic changes will make a big difference, and we can, and I believe these models can work. So when you look at open source models, there are not that many successful examples, but I think this is where India can really can be a leader.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Dr. Daya Sindhu. This, I believe, applies to all panelists. The question is, how can India nurture collaborations between universities and industries, to improve the ecosystem and take, the innovation ecosystem to the next level? The question also says, STIP mentions the importance of collaborations, but greater details would be appreciated.
Okay, can I say something, Venkat?
Yes, Professor. No.
Yes. So, nurturing collaboration between universities, right? Again, this can be done by having explicit guidelines and, policy interventions, right? For instance, the policy can say that students can transfer credits across universities very easily in the country, right? That doesn't happen today, right? You can take courses from one university partly and another university, IIT, even within IIT system, it doesn't happen, right? So that should be enabled. And you should also enable maybe joint supervision of students from, two different faculties from two different institutes. Universities essentially is a collection of human resources, which is faculty and students, right? You need to enable them. And also, you should, send a message that 1 + 1 can be more than 2, right? For instance, if there are two faculties from two different universities with complementary expertise come together, collaborate and publish a paper, you don't count that paper as half credit for each of the faculty, right? That defeats the purpose of collaboration, right? Only because of these two individuals came together, this collaboration could happen, and its value is more than the parts put together, right? So, some of these are very, very important interventions that you need to bring in terms of policies. And also the same goes with the evaluation system, for industry collaboration. Institutes should say that, well, it's not just your papers that are published will be considered for your promotions. We will also consider, give due credit on how you have worked with industry, right? So some of these things, in terms of policy, if we can bring in, there could be a lot more collaboration.
Okay. I have another question from Janice. She asked, "What are the organizational factors that must be addressed through the draft policy to overcome the value of debt in the innovation process?" Again, I think it applies to all panelists.
Yeah, so let me just give a few points here. So I think one is, of course, the collaboration angle, which was just talked about, which I think is important. That will probably help more innovations and more R&D projects from going to the logical conclusion. Second one is, of course, end-to-end funding, I think, which we already talked about. So that could be another way of overcoming that. Personally, I'm a great believer in demand-driven innovation. So the more it's driven by demand, the more likely it is to move forward, in my view. So, and India has enough demand challenges to keep innovators busy for several years, if not decades. So I think that would also be helpful. I don't know what when she says organizational factors, I'm not sure what she means, but certainly collaboration would help.
Venkat, I'll also take a stab at it. This valley of death is, of course, much talked about, and typically startups ran out of funding, or they were not able to, they didn't get as much done as they should have, so they can't raise the next tranche of funding. And in both these instances, the startup ceased to exist. So one solution to that is to make sure that is of course to be able to find appropriate funding, and in addition to what funds the government can make available, there needs to be a very big move to incentivizing private investment into R&D through a set of tax incentives or whatever else. I mean, I think that can be worked out, but the funding part of it is the easier one to solve. The more difficult one to solve is which startups do you think should actually be rescued and taken over to the other side. Identifying these startups and these innovators is again a matter of A, looking at how they fit into the innovation priorities, and B, understanding the capabilities of the entrepreneurs involved. Not all entrepreneurs are the same, and not all entrepreneurs can pull the companies over. But the leadership of this innovation infrastructure or this innovation agency, they should have, the responsibility will be with them then to identify these individuals or these companies or researchers within universities, and making sure that they don't tumble. So it's two-tiered, really.
If I were to add just one more point to this, what Janice is asking, the organizational structure or factors, it's also important for the policymakers to understand and appreciate that the so-called gestation times are different for startups in different sectors. A startup in software, for instance, or app development, gestation time is very small. Okay. On the other hand, a startup in biotechnology, let alone therapeutics, even diagnostics, right? That's much larger. A startup in nanotechnology, for instance, gestation time is much larger. That is number one. Also, the funding requirement, while 10-20 lakh could be good enough for a startup in software, that may not be sufficient for a different field. So this appreciation, if it is there, then accordingly the policies can be designed, and that will perhaps help overcome this valley of death.
Great. Thank you. Next, I have a question from Dr. Momita to Professor Krishnan. She asks about patent protection in the informal sector as well as in traditional knowledge systems. Is our patent protections a barrier to knowledge dissemination?
Yeah, I'm not very clear knowledge dissemination from who to who, but yeah, so I think in general, if you look at the traditional sector or traditional knowledge, we have been looking for somewhat unorthodox methods of protecting their knowledge. India has, for example, a big traditional knowledge depository, which is just celebrating some anniversary. I saw some thing in social media today, which has been quite a pioneering move, because very few countries have tried to capture and document and record their traditional knowledge. So that's good. And of course, we have things like the whole Honeybee network and the NIF and others who have also put a lot of effort into documenting a lot of the traditional knowledge. I don't think that is, I mean, it doesn't seem to be a big barrier to knowledge dissemination, at least the ways in which it is covered and recorded so far. The bigger challenges with the traditional knowledge seem to be more on the side of validation and trying to find sort of ways of bringing that into the mainstream. Those seem to me, as far as I can make out, the bigger challenges, and you can see how that's playing out, for example, in Ayush, where clearly there are a lot of interesting things, but there's a big debate on whether they really need to meet the same standards as, say, modern medicine, or whether the modern medicine protocol actually the right way to test, and you have highly polarized views on all that. So that seems to be a challenge, but knowledge dissemination itself doesn't seem to be such a big knowledge as far as I can make out.
Perfect. We have one question from Dr. Suresh. He's asking how can educational nudges like facilitating internships and other programs at an early career stage, even when they're in undergraduates or in the graduate schools, enable more robust research and innovation ecosystem, and how can these steps be like standardized and approached in a structural manner? I guess this is a question for everyone.
Venkat, can I answer that first? It is
Yes,
this very close to my heart actually. So at Vitas, what we did was we created internship programs for high school students, and and so we encouraged local schools, and they sent students who had a particular project interest to us, and we helped them do their project, write it up, and some of them published, some of them participated in Google Science Fairs, some of them wrote it up for their school curricula, like international curricula require certain types of projects to be done. So they were put to a variety of uses, and in all these instances, these were individuals who gained and benefited considerably because it was so different from their usual or from their standard experience in the school. Now, when I say this, I'm very aware that such models of mentorship do not scale very easily. We couldn't have done this for hundreds of students. We couldn't have done it even for tens of students. We were selective. We took only very small number of students every year, but we were committed to that. So I'm a really firm believer that in order to inculcate that innovation spirit, we'll have to go to the school level or the early college experience level and get students to come in. The only criteria we had for accepting people into these programs was that they had to propose an idea. No matter, it didn't have to be the most it didn't have to be something that could necessarily be executed in our labs or whatever, but they had to come up with an idea. That was the only bar. So these sorts of experiences, I think, are vital, and the sooner we can influence policymakers on the education side to make these types of experiences integral to the school experience, and encourage the innovation practitioners across research and industry to accept that such programs can bring value overall to the ecosystem. The sooner we can do that, the better it is. I'll tell you that from my experience, I found that in a lot of instances, these students were unable to find internships in other places because they were told they didn't have the skills. But we need to recognize that innovation starts not with having some practical skills in the laboratory, but having the skills to think. And once we make that transition in our own minds, then we can create a lot of programs for youngsters to come and learn. So, that's speaking from my own experience at Vitas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Radha. We have one final question before we wrap up. I would like to ask Dr. Gautam Sharma to turn on his audio and ask this question.
Thank you, Venkat. So my question is specifically for Professor Krishnan. So Professor Krishnan, I have also been reading the literature on frugal innovation. So my reading on this literature has been that this innovation studies literature specifically on frugal innovation is coming from scholars from either innovation studies or management studies. And they rest on the assumption that technical interventions can help us to fight poverty. So don't you think that innovation scholars also need to engage with other social science disciplines to first understand the reasons for poverty and resource scarcity which is occurring at the levels, so that we can better formulate processes for making frugal innovation successful, so that there are more examples than Arvind Eye Care or Jaipur Barefoot College. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you answered your question. So there's no doubt. Yes, answer is yes. If you want any elaboration, I don't know, but the answer is yes.
Because this is a void in the literature. There is not very much engagement with the social science disciplines how to understand the reasons for resource scarcity, why there is resource scarcity in the first place. Not all scarcity is natural, some is socially constructed also.
Yeah, of course, I think one should be careful perhaps in tarring everybody with the same brush. I mean, yes, people like C.K. Prahlad, that accusation might be fair enough because I think they did make certain assumptions particularly in all this bottom of the pyramid kind of approach. But I think many people are quite sensitive to that issue. Of course, you cannot be an expert in all disciplines. But I think many of us are quite aware of the fact that social scientists have been studying poverty and economic development for years, and it's all multidimensional, lot of connections, and there's no magic wand, particularly suddenly getting people to be producing things at the bottom of the pyramid to solve that. I don't think we are under any such illusion. So I think your point is well taken, and undoubtedly partnership with social scientists would be good. So if you're interested in collaborating, let me know.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I will sure.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I guess we have to, we are at 7 now. I would first like to thank the panelists, all three panelists, Professor Rishi Krishnan, Professor Naukant Bhatt, Dr. Radha Rangarajan, for giving their very precious Sunday evening to all of us, and also their insights. I also like to thank all the guests and the attendees for asking questions. We can wrap up the event here with final words from the panelists, if they have anything to say.
I don't have anything to add. Thanks for inviting me. I think to end on a positive note, I certainly appreciate the effort which the PSA and the government have taken in formulating this policy. Amazing level of consultation with people across the spectrum. I've seen very few policy initiatives in which this has been done. But notwithstanding that, I think there's still some room for elaborating some things in the policy. And I think my fellow panelists made excellent points, which hopefully will be reflected in the policy.
Yeah, I don't have anything more to add, Venkat. Yeah.
Thanks.
I just want to thank you all for the opportunity to be present here, and also that I want to deeply appreciate the thinking that has gone into the innovation policy, the extent to which it has been thought out, and I want to congratulate the PSA for really making this a huge priority, for proactively thinking this through, and for involving so many stakeholders. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you from Professor Abhi as well, who has typed it in the chat to all the panelists. Janice.
Yeah, thanks, Venkat. And I would just request all the panelists to switch on their videos so that we could have a quick photograph, just to frame this whole thing. Yes. Maybe Suresh, you could stop the recording. I think people are not switching on their camera because the recording is on.